Faze clan have already announced for their Counter-Strike roster that they have acquired Guardian to replace Allu. Now, there are also rumors and there is certain speculation surrounding the possible acquisition of Olofmeister as well, presumably to replace Kiyoshima, because Rain has been doing a fairly good job so far. Now, in order to analyze these roster moves, we need to very quickly go over what kind of a team Faze clan is. Faze is a team that relies on having Nico be their complete dominant star, and then as a secondary star, they don't really have any one person. Technically speaking, it should be Rain, but more often than not, he does end up being more of a tertiary role and occasionally does step up, and this seems to be the story for the entirety of the Faze clan members. They all, other than Karrigan, seem to be taking turns to step up and in particular games carry the weight of the secondary star, while Nico is always the person who is on that one position. There are times when Kiyoshima steps up and has an absolutely monstrous game. In particular, IEM Sydney is one that you think of immediately. There are times when Rain steps up, for example, in the Major and in ESL 1 Cologne in particular. And there are times when Allu is the person stepping up to be that secondary spot. Now, in order for us to actually properly understand what exactly will be the impact, we need to keep this in mind going forward. This style has not been sufficient to beat SK. This style has not been sufficient for them to win tournaments, although they have won a couple of tournaments. Largely for them to be able to come out on top in a tournament, they would rely on Astralis beating SK, which is why a roster move was definitely very, very imminent, and it makes sense why they had to remove Allu, because he is definitely their most inconsistent player compared to the rest of them, despite him doing a decent job. Thorin has covered this pretty effectively in his video. I'm going to try and link it somewhere over here so you can check that out. But that's not what we're going to be discussing in particular. What we're going to be discussing in particular is the possible second addition to their roster, which there is speculation surrounding being Olofmeister to replace Kiyoshima. Now, I'm personally not a fan of replacing Kiyoshima at all, because Kiyoshima has been doing a very good job and he has been one of the better players in that role all across the world. So initially, I don't think that Kyo should be replaced. However, it is entirely possible that there are some just some interior problems going on within the rosters. Kyo is known to be a very emotional player, and removing him could end up adding to their chemistry or something on those lines. So I do understand why they would have to. However, I still think that Olofmeister being added is a big question mark. Why? Simply because there would be too many stars in this team. You already have Nico, who is definitely going to be the primary star. You have Guardian, who is incredibly used to having a system around him to be able to enable him to be at his absolute best. And then you add Olofmeister as well, presumably pushing Rain down to either the 4-position support role, or you keep Rain on the tertiary position and you can hope that Olof is in that 4 position. I personally think that this is completely overloading the star meter. The only way this can work out, and in all fairness, this is a gamble, but it can pay off very, very effectively. And if they're able to make this work, then Faze is undoubtedly going to be the best team in the world. If Olof is able to play a little bit of a Zipnik's role where fine, he's a support player, but because of his incredibly high degree of game sense, because of his incredibly high mechanical skill, he's able to be that clutch player. He's able to be the person who you can rely on to be able to step up and key rounds, then yes, it can work. However, that also relies on Olof being able to get along with some incredibly emotional players, and that relies on him being able to put aside some of his ego and some of his prior fame to degrade himself down towards a lower level of play, or so it may seem to some particular players. And this is going to be a big question mark. Now, the reason why I say that I don't really like Olof being added is because there's a lot of free agents on the market who would do the job better, in my opinion. Let's look at the most immediate one that should come to everyone's mind, Seized from Na'Vi. And I doubt that Seized will be added, because if they were going to buy him out, then it would be more likely than not that it would be coming out with the addition of Guardian as well. But Seized being added to the roster of Faze could be massive. Seized, before he became in-game leader, everyone remembers he was an amazing support player. He did wonders when he was working underneath the system of Zeus, when he had a proper dedicated in-game leader to be able to tell him what to do, and he wasn't the one who was carrying the burden of being the in-game leader. In addition to that, he would fit into Karrigan's style of in-game leading incredibly well as well. Because if you look over towards Karrigan, historically, Karrigan has been a little bit of a dictatorship in-game leader. He has a very set, specific idea of how the game should be played, and he wants his players to come down to and be flexible according to him instead of the other way around. Karrigan is not an in-game leader known for switching around his style all too much. Now, if you move on and you actually go back a little bit and you consider what would have been if they hadn't picked up Guardian and they were picking up Olaf instead as a secondary star, then things become a lot more interesting. We can go back towards the addition of Seized and the alternatives in a little while, but before that, I want everyone to very quickly consider the possibility where instead of Guardian, Olaf is the addition who will be coming towards Faze to replace Kiyoshima, and instead of Guardian, you try to get an Opera who's incredibly good, but he isn't quite particularly at the same level as Guardian. However, that also means that he won't really be taking the same amount of space. Now, in particular, there's two Operas who come to mind. Firstly, there's Oscar from Mousesports, and I think Oscar from Mousesports would be the perfect position. He's played a secondary star role in Mousesports. He's an incredibly good AWP player. He's played at the top levels, but he's also not been playing in a tier 1 team for as long as I can personally remember. So Oscar would be willing to downgrade himself towards that Allu style of play where he's not exactly a support Opera, but he isn't a star role Opera either. He's just an incredibly reliable, solid player. And then with the combination of Olaf and Nico being your 1 and 2 position, that could be incredibly good. The second player who comes to mind is a little bit more of a star player, but he's also in the same role where, okay, fine, he's a great Opera, but he's in a team which isn't really going to be yielding great results. And Faze is one of the few people who might actually be able to afford his buyout, considering that they did actually end up acquiring Guardian. And I'm talking about Mixwell from Optic. Mixwell being added to Faze would be a ridiculous, absolutely ridiculously interesting thing to see, because Mixwell, Olofmeister, and then you combine Nico over there as well. That's a very interesting combination to see. Of course, that does rely on Mixwell on being the primary Opera, which he has publicly stated that he doesn't want to be. But it also means that you have 5 very, very solid riflers, where Guardian, yes, he's an okay rifler. He's okay with the AK-47, but he's not really famous for it. While Mixwell, he's amazing on the rifles. He's even better on the AWP, admittedly. So you've basically got pretty much everything you want going for yourself, with Nico as your primary star, with Olaf as your secondary star. Rain would probably have to be bumped down towards that Kyo role, which I think Rain would be fine with. And then you've got Mixwell being your primary Opera, who does get some priority, but he's more in the Allu position where, okay, fine, he's not your star player, but he's a very, very good Opera, and he can show up with rifles as well, so your team's economy won't be crippled, and your team's firepower will not be crippled if you can't really afford an AWP, which is incredibly core to remember in the CT side. In addition to that, it also opens up a lot of different possibilities of the double ops setup with the combination of Nico and Olaf. Both of those players have been known to pick up the ops in the past, so it's just a lot of different setups that they could actually go for. Now, back towards potential replacements for Olaf, because obviously Guardian has already been acquired, so there's very little point in actually discussing that further on. Potentially, instead of Olofmeister, we've already talked about Seized, who was a fantastic support player. Then let's look at someone who a little bit more old school. Back in the day, Freiburg was an amazing player. He was more of an entry style player, but now he's become a little bit more down to earth, I would like to think, and I would like to think that he would be a lot more flexible in that particular role. Of course, Freiburg is a massive gamble. He wasn't really playing to his best later on in his later years, and it wasn't really easy. It wouldn't really be easy for him to be able to take that role in a top 3 team like FaZe Clan, so I understand why they wouldn't really go for him. Finally, the other free agent that might be coming to a few people's minds is Magicsploit. I don't personally know what I think about this, but I think Magicsploit and Olofmeister are 2 players who are very, very similar in terms of if you want to acquire them, then there's the same logic behind both of them, because these are great mechanically skilled players. These are both players who have shown incredible game sense in clutch positions. These are both players who could potentially, if they take that role and they're able to successfully kill their own ego, then these are both players who could potentially take that Xyp9x role, where Xyp9x right now considered one of the best clutchers, one of the best support players in the world, along with people like NBK in the European scene. And they could take that role and they could perform that to perfection. However, at the same time, Magisk is a very young player. He's a player who's used to being the star whenever he's been at his prime. He's a player who has been given a lot of priority, and in particular, he's just a player who is a little bit egotistical, I'd like to say, and there's a lot of attitude problems that would come in, and that's something we need to keep in mind. because now you have Guardian, you have Nico, and both of these players are incredibly passionate, they're incredibly fiery, and they get angry incredibly easily. So this is a team that not only is it going to be hard for you to actually bring together a combination of 4 players with 2 players with Karrigan, considering you already have Nico and Guardian, who will be able to get along effectively with these 2 players and will be able to mesh together in a system. It's just incredibly difficult to keep the team together. What I personally think will happen, even with the current potential roster iteration that we expect to see, which is Rain, Olofmeister, Nico, Guardian, and Karrigan, I think that all 5 of these will be sticking together for a little while. For the first few months, they're going to be doing great, but by the time the next major rolls out, they are going to fall apart immediately. I don't personally think that they have the emotional stability to be able to continue on. And that's something that you need to keep in mind. Faze clan currently have a coach, Robban, who is specifically for preventing these things. He is not an in-game coach. He is not a tactical coach. He is a person who's there just to correct the very, very simple things in their Counter-Strike. And then more importantly, he's just there to improve team chemistry and make sure that these people do not fall apart. And that's something very incredibly important to keep in mind. Now, on the note of a coach, I personally think that no matter what happens, no matter how many star players you add, Karrigan has failed as an in-game leader. Karrigan as an in-game leader is not capable of taking this team to victory on his own, and it's not entirely his fault, honestly. Personally, I think that they need a different coach. Robban is a great coach from what I've heard and what I've verified from a few personalities, Lurpus in particular. Robban is not someone who is a tactical coach. He's not someone who's going to be affecting their in-game all too greatly. He's someone who's going to be treating their chemistry, looking at small team play errors. That is not enough. We've already seen Guardian is used to having a system around him. Olaf will not work unless he's got a system around him anymore. He is not the star player that he was once upon a time where you could just go remove heads everywhere. Olaf is not at the top of the world anymore. These are players who require a system around them to be able to work effectively. And while Karrigan's system is very, very loose and it's practically non-existent, the addition of a coach could really shape things up. Of course, the difficult thing would be to be able to find a coach who these players actually respect. And to actually solve that problem, I've only come up with 2 players or 2 coaches who could potentially fulfill the role and be able to provide the structural style that they need. And the first one is very unlikely, personally, that he would either leave his organization or that these players would be willing to listen to him properly. But I think as an addition, he could be one of the best possible things to happen to Faze. Kakafu from Big Clan. Big Clan as a team is infamous for having incredibly tactical style, strategic oriented strategic oriented gameplay, and that's something that you're going to be seeing a lot in games where Big is playing, where Gob B and Kakafu are the real minds behind that team. You bring Kakafu into Faze and suddenly you've got a killer combination between him and Karrigan on being able to find the perfect balance between a loose play and a little bit of a structured style of Counter-Strike. And that's where suddenly things get incredibly interesting, because SK so far has only really been beating Faze every single time because they have more structure, because they have better structure, because they have better crossfires, they have better defaults, they have better idea of what they want to do, while Faze is mostly reliant on, okay, vaguely, I'm going to play this side. Nico, you go play Squeaky Door. Or, you know, Kiyoshima, you go play a mid position. Just kill people. That's what Faze's style seems to be more like, relying on their individual skill. However, you bring in Kakafu, you bring in someone like that, and that becomes incredibly powerful, where suddenly you've got your defaults. You are basically going towards that SK style play where you've got one of the best players in the world, which is Nico. You've, as your Coldzera equivalent, you've got Guardian, potentially equivalent to Fallen. I personally think Fallen's a better AWPer than Guardian ever will be ever again, but you know, an argument could be made about his skill ceiling. And then obviously you've got incredibly skilled players below them as well. So the problem is Kakafu is a German player. He's very attached towards the Big Clan organization from what I understand. If he isn't able to be bought out, that's where you look towards someone a little bit more interesting and someone who might have a little bit more chemistry with Karrigan, to be perfectly honest. And I speak of Fetish from Heroic. Now, Fetish from Heroic is a very interesting thing for me because, first of all, Heroic is a team that has a very structured style of play that was centered around having a star player in Valde, and they had a lot of decent success, even though they have a little bit, subpar players. So I'm not really going to blame Fetish for that. However, the thing about Fetish is, as a player, he's a very, very good player. He has actually, at least in the past, so he's actually achieved top 4 in, I believe it is 6 out of 7 of the premier tournaments that he's actually attended, even having achieved 2nd at ESWC 2011. So you look at that track record, you look at the fact that he's a Danish player who has played with the same teammates as Carrigan did in the past. He played with the core of Astralis, that is to say Zipnex, Rupi and Device. He played with a lot of these Danish players, and that means that you could potentially end up seeing Fetish and Carrigan having some serious chemistry. Admittedly, if I remember correctly, Carrigan has actually been the replacement for Fetish pretty much every single time, so they don't really have any history of playing together as far as I could find out in my very quick research. However, Fetish being added to it could really put things into perspective, because he is used to having a team which is centered around a star player. He is used to being able to provide a structure to the team while being able to, bring out the most in these star players. And you combine that with Carrigan's experience, and that's where suddenly you could see Guardian transition to more of a Device style of AWP play. That's where, Device, hands down, right now, I think best opera in the world. So you could see Guardian transition more towards the Device style of AWP play, and it can't be argued by anyone that Device in his raw skill, in his prime, was not better than Device, at least in terms of aim. Yes, Device definitely takes the cake in terms of positioning, etc., that give him an edge overall in the op versus op debate, but Guardian was really, really up there in terms of his raw aim. And the addition of Fetish could really shape things up. Of course, at the end of the day, you need to come down and think to yourself, you've got potentially Olof, Rain, Guardian, Nico, and Carrigan. Is Carrigan a strong enough in-game leader to be able to solo these 4 star players into their perfect roles, into the place where they can each play at their peak, when Carrigan is so incredibly used to playing a loose style of play where they're relying entirely on talent and star-based lineups, which we have seen from Fnatic, which we have seen from G2. These do not really work. You need some sort of structure, you need some sort of strategy, and while you have to be careful to achieve the balance between strategy and loose style of play when you've got this many star players, is Carrigan enough to do it? I personally don't think so. When it comes to the roster moves, again, to summarize, I don't think Olof is a good choice. I think there's better choices around there, and in particular, the biggest one for me is Seized. However, Olof is a gamble that has incredibly high payout if it does work out, so it does make sense if they want to go for that gamble, if they want to gamble to be the absolute best in the world. However, final notes, FaZe Clan cannot and will not succeed unless they get a change of coach. They will fall apart within the next few months. They do not have the chemistry, they do not have the emotional power, and they will have way too much star power, especially if Olof gets added, to be able to survive the next few months before the major actually comes around. Though they may have some success, the major is not going to be where it's had.